brief interview session, slightly different format. There's only 2 panellists. For those of you joining online, my name's Louise Herring. I'm Executive Director of AIM Progress, a collaborative network of fast-moving consumer goods brands and their suppliers working together on human rights. So this session we're going to focus in on a slightly different topic. We're going to talk about fraudulent job schemes. And just to set the scene in terms of what we're going to be talking through, very specifically we're talking about false offers of employment. So workers who are paying money for false or non-existent jobs. And those kind of schemes globally funnel millions of dollars a year into the pockets of fraudulent recruiters. It's a type of fraud that is widespread, that harms families and communities and pushes victims into poverty and debt. It's illegal in the majority of countries, but these practices are proliferating at an alarming rate. And what we're seeing is increased complexity, fueled by a lot of the things we've talked about already today: high demand for migrant workers, little transparency, and under-regulated labour recruitment markets. So today we're going to zone in on 2 particular examples of these fraudulent job schemes. One in the UK, so James is going to introduce that, and then one in Malaysia, which Rosie, who's joining us virtually from the UK, is going to talk about. Rosie Hurst from Impact. James, can I ask you to start us off, to introduce yourself and give us a picture of what fraudulent jobs look like in the countries that Proforce operate in?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. So I've been granted 3 minutes, so Pavel's luxury of 5 has been well surpassed. So I'm James Malik. I'm Compliance Director at Proforce. We're the UK's largest agricultural recruiter, supplying circa 27,000 workers a year into the UK labour market. Historically, pre-Brexit, and I'm not going to get into that conversation, but I'm certainly on the Remain side. Historically, we have recruited those workers from the UK or from Europe, where freedom of movement existed. And more recently, we've then had to go further afield, and Proforce are one of 6 approved licence holders in the UK that can sponsor seasonal workers. Our recruitment is done by ourselves in the vast majority of cases, and as a result of the Ukraine invasion, where the majority of our recruitment was happening for the seasonal worker scheme, we've had to move slightly further afield to mainly Central Asia, which will be about 85% of our seasonal workers this year. So I think in terms of just defining what we see, there's probably 3, if I'm going to simplify it, 3 key aspects. One is that genuine fraudulent activity, either by passing off, so taking branding of a genuine recruiter, saying there is a job available, asking for a payment online. The job does not exist. The worker doesn't know this, and we find out about it when the worker contacts us sometime later and says, "Where's my job?" And this is the first we've heard of it. But there's also agencies operating with their own branding that don't actually offer a job at the end of it. Then there's this sort of hybrid in the middle where a recruiter is saying, "I've got jobs," and effectively what they do is just introduce the individual to the genuine recruiter. Little does the genuine recruiter know. Or, in some cases, they just give them the advert for that job and ask them to apply. And then, slightly off topic, but I think equally important, what we also see is a service industry popping up around it, offering services that aren't required. So, for example, in Central Asia, that'll be visa support. In Central Asia, we work with labour ministries of the country, and the worker is supported to make their visa application by Proforce and by the labour ministry. By the time they know that, it's too late, because they haven't been to our website, they haven't been to one of our recruitment events, they aren't in our process, but they've already paid. So I think, at a base level, they're the 3 key sort of sectors of where we see this issue happening.
Great, thank you, James. I think that's very clear. Rosie, welcome. Rosie is in unseasonably warm London. It's not something that we're used to. So it's probably about 10 o'clock at night and 28 degrees. Rosie, welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself to the room and give us the same perspective that James has of what have you seen, what has Impact seen of what this looks like in Malaysia?
Okay, so hello everyone. I'm Rosie Hurst, founder of Impact, and we do a lot of work on migrant worker issues with a specific focus on remedy. And I just wanted to share a quick insight into other aspects of criminality, bribery and corruption, which are often rather shadowy, and we often actually can't see what's going on. We have these suspicions of kickbacks, bribery and corruption. There's a case that we were working on in Malaysia recently where we were able to get information from a lot of WhatsApps in order to understand who was paying what for whom, who's paying whom for what along the labour supply chain, and it was very instructive. So what we found, for example, was that the employer in this case was paying $550 per worker to be recruited from Nepal. The Malaysian agent simply pocketed all of that money and charged a Nepali agent $780 per worker, so that you can see how much per worker the Malaysian agent is making. But and to say more than that, the workers each pay between $3,000 and $4,000. So you can kind of understand a little bit how this starts to work. But then you factor in all the kickbacks. So how is this money being passed along, and what is it being spent on? So these trails of WhatsApp messages showed improper relations with police, improper relations with the labour ministries, very cosy relationships, lunches and things like that with decision makers, but also the use of prostitutes, a lot of detail about the use of prostitutes, as well as 5-star trips for employers and a lot of other stuff as well. So that starts to unpack what is really going on when we look particularly at Part C of the ILO definition of fees and charges. Now, our suspicion is it's very unusual to have this level of information, but our suspicion is the majority of, shall we say, virgin labour supply chains this is how they work. So the kind of practice that was being described, the emerging best practice that we had described in the last session, is a kind of drop in this much more sinister ocean. I feel that often many of the technical guides don't linger sufficiently on the issue of corruption, kickbacks and criminality. And I think it's time that we all understood a lot more about where those opportunities of corruption are, and how we can improve due diligence to root it out. That was my little intro, Louise.
Thank you, Rosie, that's super. Can I ask you to kind of continue on that theme? I mean, you've started to talk about root causes. You've started to talk about the criminality and where that's coming from. As much as you can in that Malaysia case, what do we know, do we not know about the root causes of that case, and how far was there able to be kind of transparency of where this criminality was starting from?
Well, we were very lucky in that we had a very supportive supply chain, a very supportive employer in this case, and very supportive retailers and brands also, who genuinely wanted to try and find out about this rather than rushing to punishment. And I think that's very important because, as we know in this field, understanding the diagnostic, really understanding this stuff helps you to tackle the root causes. I think there are several interesting points here. Often there's a lot of blame put on the source country, because it's said it's the source country where all the illegality is. It's the source country where there isn't good governance. But what we're seeing here is a large amount of...
James, can you talk about the kind of UK cases that you've seen in the same way that Rosie was explaining? What do we know about where that criminality comes from? What do we not know?
Yeah.
How does that work for the UK?
I think we've touched on the root causes probably a couple of times today. Certainly Rebecca identified it in her keynote speech at the start, and I think it's not new. Yesterday I went to the Ellis Island Migration Museum, and the root causes were true then, and that is a real desire of migrants to improve their lives. The opportunity to come and work in the UK on seasonal agriculture work from Central Asia genuinely represents 10 to 20 times improved net income per year on a return basis every year. That is, massive. It genuinely is huge. And that's one of the root causes. That is shiny gold, I think was the phrase that was used earlier, in the workers' eyes. That is that desire to go and improve their own standing at home, the standing and lives of their children. And I think that is fundamentally creating that opportunity. And unfortunately what happens, and what we see quite often in the fraudulent adverts, is not only does the job not exist, it's being presented as one of the best jobs. It is the shiny gold, it's the best, it's the highest income. And it's not just, maybe the recruiter's advert that's being passed off. Sometimes we're actually seeing now the end employer is being passed off on that fraudulent advert. And with the advent of social media, workers are more connected than they've ever been. So workers also understand where the best job is. And when that job pops up as an advert, that's where the root cause comes from. There is a real desire, and that's creating the opportunity. With opportunity comes, great income. So what a worker may be paying one of the fraudulent adverts is more than we get paid by our customer to do the recruitment properly. And we don't charge the workers for any of our services whatsoever. So, that is the potential income. We run a very viable, commercially profitable business, but we are charging less than the criminals. So the opportunity to earn money for a criminal is huge. And also it happens usually in an environment that is really uncontrollable. So, it happens in a country that is not part of the scheme. It's probably not the source country. We have heard of some of the progressions around AI, and the opportunity for that to expand and explode is really quite concerning.
If people haven't read, I'm sure a lot of people in the room have, but if people haven't read The Fourth Time We Drowned, or The Fourth Time I Drowned, it's a journalist account of migrants' journeys from Libya and the surrounding areas to the UK. Yes, if you want to explore more about the root causes of this criminality, it's a fairly dark read, I think, but a very kind of real one. I'm going to go on to I don't know whether to try Rosie's sound again. Rosie, do you want to try talking to us? Nothing. Okay, all right. James, let's move on to what can be done. Let's talk about in these cases, so it's obviously something your business has experienced, these cases of fraudulent jobs. What can be done? What do you think is the role of businesses like your own? What is the role of the sending and receiving governments? What's the role of other stakeholders? Because, I can see, and I know I've worked with businesses in the UK that have been subject to this same fraud. It's hard to know what role business has in this. To some extent, it's not your responsibility, but on the other hand, obviously it's impacting upon workers, and you want to do something from a moral perspective. So, yeah, what are the things that you think business and other stakeholders should be doing?
Sorry, is it Mark? Yeah, in your session earlier, you referenced sort of worker knowledge, and I think that's really important. These things are very, very difficult, probably impossible to fix from a recruiter's point of view or from an end user's point of view, because it's criminal activity. So what you have to rely on is worker knowledge to make informed decisions. And if a worker can make an informed decision, they're less likely to decide to make a payment online for a job that doesn't exist, because they know that they don't need to pay for a job because the recruiter, who's the genuine one, isn't charging them. So as businesses, I think what we have to do is invest in educating workers. And that's then quite a difficult commercial discussion, I can assure you, because we have to kind of approach that from a point of view of educating everybody, even if they might not apply. If you take Central Asia, for example, in the 3 countries that we source from predominantly, total population is probably about 60 million. We might recruit 6,000 workers from there this year. So how do you fund a worker project around education or around increasing knowledge when you're talking to a lot of people? And so therefore, you have to do a number of things. So, we work with the labour ministries in those countries, and they have a real responsibility to also take proactive action to educate workers. And that's being done through some collaboration we've had with the IOM, where we've written pre-departure training, which is now being rolled out by the Labour Ministry. So workers are getting genuine, proper, clear, concise information about the seasonal worker scheme. I think it goes slightly further than that in terms of what else can be done, because again, it's a bit too late if it's done by the migration centre, because the worker's already in the process. So you have to go one step further. For example, if you went to our website, it would tell you don't pay any work finding fees. If you came to one of our recruitment sessions, it would tell you don't pay work finding fees. If you go to our social media pages, it says don't pay work finding fees. Workers are paying work finding fees because all those things come too late. So what we're trying to do now is create some open source information that's just more widely available. One of those things is the Just Good Work app, which we've been investing in and funding from a sort of recruiter's point of view now since 2021, when we first translated it to Ukrainian, because that was one of our key source countries. And then over the last couple of years, retailers and users of the seasonal worker scheme in the UK.
Well, now I hope you get it back in time for you.
And operators. Are we back? And
Hello.
Hello, we can hear you, Rosie.
Oh, good. We were chatting in the green room because we can hear what you're doing. We were worried about whether we're back on for the next session, but it sounds to be on. Sorry, James, you carry on.
No problem. Yeah. So if I can just make a couple more points, and then Rosie, all the time is yours. So we've invested in Just Good Work app. Retailers, operators, recruiters have come together to fund that. It now has a specific seasonal worker section, and it's open source, it's free. So what we're now trying to do is publicise that so that workers go there before they come to us. So they can get factual information on there, they can check, is this a genuine recruiter? We've built a worker information video for the Gangmaster Labour Abuse Authority, which is just launched in the UK this week, and the translated versions come out next week, where we have workers talking about their experience of the scheme. The fact that they didn't have to pay work finding fees to come into the scheme, that when they're on farm, what their accommodation is like, what the work is like. Working in agriculture, and I know because I've done it, is tough. In the UK, the weather is wet a lot of the time, and sometimes it's really hot, and then it's wet again a lot of the time. I felt quite at home here last night. And so it's about kind of getting one step ahead, one step earlier in the process. And that GLAA video hopefully is going to form part of that.
Thanks, James. And can I just, a quick follow-up question, and then I'll come to you, Rosie, because we don't want to lose you again. But Rosie said in her introduction about bribery and corruption, and that takes us into a different realm. Have you found that in relation to the fraudulent jobs that your business have identified that the government in the UK have engaged in that problem and been supportive of it? If you can diplomatically answer that one, or we might just take your...
So I think probably in the UK, the environment with the seasonal worker scheme is quite different. We're approved as a sponsor, and our welfare responsibilities are there throughout the course of the programme. So when a worker is on farm, if the farm does something wrong, we are responsible. Even though they're not working on our farm, we're just the recruiter. But legally, we're responsible for their welfare. And I think we've seen much of this has fallen to the operators. And there are some great NGOs that have been involved. And in the UK, as a result of some of the poor media coverage that was, and some of the reporting that we had in 2022, there's a seasonal worker task force that's been convened by a number of NGOs, retailers, the operators, and government bodies, who are now really sort of collaborating and talking openly about some of the challenges. And I think that's a good starting point.
Yeah, great.
If that diplomatically answers your question.
That's very diplomatic. Well done, you. Rosie, let's go to you then on the question that I addressed to James in terms of what can be done about these fraudulent job schemes. So we were talking about the different actors. Hopefully you could hear us of, the labour providers. James gave the perspective of what they've done to try and tackle the risks. But also, obviously, there is a government both sending and receiving government role. So what is your perspective on how we try and tackle this criminality? Should we try and tackle this criminality, and who should be doing what?
Yes, absolutely. We must remember that it is the workers who are the victims of criminality. So it's important that we do not forget that it is vital to deliver remedy to those workers, whether the fees and charges and payments they're made fall under A, B or C in the ILO definitions. So I would urge all stakeholders to ensure that we don't get muddled up and worry about companies being victims here. It is the workers who are victims, not the companies. So we must start with remedy for workers. Then we need to redouble all efforts on due diligence. And James has spoken in some ways about this, but we need to remember that all the time, because we're fishing in such a polluted sea, all the time we should be looking to remedy those problems which we find. So, I mean, in most of the cases we work on, the recruitment that occurs after we have delivered remedy probably is able to reduce fees, the fees and charges paid by workers by 60%, which means that workers are still paying 40%, and that must be paid back to workers. And indeed, we find it is delivering that remedy which acts as the spur to enforcing property diligence and eliminating fraudulent job schemes, and as well as kickbacks and other corrupt activities. So I start with the worker, and I start with remedying the worker. And I think that is where we need to make sure that we don't forget why we're doing this in the first place. Why we're doing this in the first place is to ensure a supply of legally recruited non-paying workers into our farms, factories, all over the world. And at the moment, the people who are funding that are workers, and that is where we need to start when it comes to sorting this out.
Thanks, Rosie. In the case, if I can just pick up on your point there about remedy for workers, in the case that James described, where actually the worker is applying for a job that doesn't exist, the recruitment organisation aren't linked to that job that's being offered, the employer isn't being linked to that job, where from your experience can the remedy come from in that example, or where should it come from in your view?
Where should it go? I mean, I think that there needs to be swifter action in identifying these fraudulent schemes. Because obviously having somebody reporting to be you, it's very important that companies start to crawl all over Facebook, because you can find these things by simply Googling in order to stop them before they start. I think that it's important, for example, to take cases in local courts. And I think it might also be important for at country and market level for there to be remedy funds established, because otherwise, I mean, there needs to be a way of cutting this off at the source without further penalising workers. So the workers that James is talking about have lost out a huge amount of money. Their families are deeply indebted, and we can't allow that to happen on the basis of promises of jobs and possibly insufficient due diligence. So I just repeat, we need to really sharpen up. And I'm sure, James, this year that won't happen again because we're much more on our toes than we were last year and the year and indeed the year before that. And we all need to make sure we are much more on our toes. But we need to clear up the mess that we have made.
Thanks, Rosie. And James, I mean, do you want to add to that one in terms of who should remedy in those cases? What's your view?
I think it's quite a challenging one, particularly in the UK at the moment, because of I've touched already on the fact that the amount of fees that are being levied by the criminal exceed what we charge the client to do it properly. They're just, from our perspective, there isn't that sufficient income from the supply chain, and that probably then comes down to consumers. In the UK, we've become very used to cheap food in the main, and maybe that's where there needs to be some consideration.
Great, thank you. Listen, thank you both of you for giving us an insight. Thank you, Rosie, for bearing with us through the technical issues. I think what we've talked about in terms of this criminality, the scale and the depth of those issues is beyond really what we've got time to discuss today, and I think does take us into a different area of bribery and corruption that is very complex. We know there's an enormous amount of money, as James has highlighted, to be made from fraudulent recruitment, and with more people on the move than ever before, unfortunately, it's a risk that we're going to see more of. So thank you, Rosie and James, for bringing that issue to life, and thank you everyone for joining us.